Well, sometimes I've got a plan, sometimes I've got no plan, and then days like this, I've got a plan to have no plan. So I'm going to start this session off just by laying down some kind of random watercolor marks. I'm going to shade some things, create some areas of contrast, and then once that dries, I'm going to come back into it, and I'm going to just start turning these into things. So I don't really have much of an idea as far as what I'm going to do. So in that aspect, I don't have a plan, but the plan that I do have is just to create some things like this at the beginning that are going to be a little bit interesting and give me something to work with. As I was getting set up for this session, the thought that popped into my mind for talking about with it was, am I good enough? And I think that's a good question. I think it's a good thing to kind of think about as an artist, because I think that most of us would unequivocally say that we are not good enough. But I doubt that many of us have ever sat down and actually thought about what that means and what we mean by good enough. So if you're good enough, that means that you have some idea, some goal, some purpose, right? Good enough for what? Good enough to what end? In my case, for example, good enough might be that I can actually get the characters for my stories out of my head and onto paper. And in that aspect, am I good enough? No, not at all. Not even close. But if I don't bother to think about what good enough is for, what the goal of that is, if I'm just stuck in this rut of, I'm not good enough, then I'm not going to get anywhere with it. Nothing's going to come of my practice, nothing's going to come of my work. And so knowing that my chief goal is to basically take stories that I want to tell, things that I want to see, and get them out of my head, get them onto paper, well, now I have marching orders and I know what to do. And I think that can be really helpful when you don't feel like you're good enough. The other side of it too is that just as artists in general, we don't often think that we're good enough, and we probably could stand to be a little bit kinder and realize that this thing that we want to do, this craft, is very difficult. It's very hard. The more I've been thinking about it lately and in some of the podcasts that I've recorded, I've really been processing and thinking about the fact that trying to get good at art and looking at artistic skill is not fairly done if it's done in the same way that it is with other things. What I mean by that is art has so many facets that becoming proficient in some capacity is just much, much more. It's not that it's like way more difficult, it's just that so much more is entailed in that process than it is with so many other things. So in teaching, for example, I taught for 11 years. The skills that you had to be proficient with in teaching math, for example, is obviously, like, number one, you have to understand the content that you're teaching. But you don't have to understand it that much better than the students that you're teaching. So I spent a time tutoring 5th grade math. A buddy of mine was teaching the classes. He was a fantastic teacher, still is a fantastic teacher. And there was just a lot of kids who were really struggling in that class by no fault of his, and so they needed some extra help. So I spent a semester, or maybe 2, helping tutor that math class. And you didn't really need to know a lot more about math than a 5th grader knew. So in that particular situation, teaching 5th grade math, you had to have a pretty good understanding of the math that 5th graders were going to do, which was not particularly complicated. You're not even getting into algebra at that point. You're mostly just working on addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. There was lots of number grouping and like very, very basic algorithmic components, like the precursors of algebra. And I'm pretty good with math. So that wasn't very difficult for me. So once you have like a basic grip on what it is you have to teach, you need to understand a little bit about human psychology and how to beneficially manipulate all of the students in the room so that they are able to get all of the things that you want or need them to get out of it. And manipulation has such a negative connotation, but the reality is, like, if you have a group of 10-year-olds, like, they don't want to learn math. They want to play, they want to talk to each other, they want to learn things that they think of as more fun. And so your goal is to manipulate that situation to make math more fun, more desirable, to give them a true sense of satisfaction once they learn it, once they have a lot going in their minds when it comes to it. So you're trying to manipulate the circumstances more than the actual humans. So you need to understand how to do that. You need to understand how to classroom manage. You need to have a very rudimentary understanding of planning and what you have to get done over the course of the whole year. And like that's a group of skills that takes, about 3 years to really handle. Like if you come into teaching, you've got an education degree, or you've got a degree in something that is adjacent to what it is you're teaching, you're looking at about 3 years to really understand how to teach and how to teach really well. That's what we always saw. That's what a lot of studies show as well. But with art, you don't have like 4 or 5 skills that you're working on handling. You have like 40 or 50 different skills that you're working on. So, for example, if you were just working on drawing human anatomy and understanding the human figure really well and accurately, like you were going to be a scientific artist, right? You're going to do diagrams and things for textbooks. That's probably going to take about the same amount of time to become proficient at as teaching. You're probably going to have to study for, 2 to 4 years of higher education, and then you're going to spend a couple years practicing. But if you want to take those pieces of knowledge that you have and then turn them into interesting figures that are posed in interesting ways, well, now we've got to add on, another task. If you want to learn how to put expressions on them and to vary those expressions, now I've got another task. So we've just added a year. If you want to learn how to have them interacting with other figures to really vary things, to exaggerate them perhaps into cartoony fashions, well, now you've added another 6 months to a year. And then all of a sudden, like, you're just good at drawing the people. Like, you haven't put them in any kind of image. Oh, well, now we need composition. So now you're going to spend another 6 months to a year learning composition and really wrapping your head around it. And all of these things, too, like any job, like any occupation, any skill set, it's not like you learn them and it's like, okay, box checked, composition, good. It's not how it works with learning how to play an instrument. It's not how it works with teaching. It's not how it works with being an engineer. Like, you learn enough to do it efficiently and sufficiently, and then you keep adding on that, and you keep learning more as you go further and further and further down the line. But that's the thing with art, is we can keep going. And like, the goal here might be just to be able to draw a figure from imagination with another figure posed in a pleasant composition with some background features. Like, pretty simple stuff when you think of it in terms of taking a look on Instagram and seeing that like tons of people do this. But there are so many elements in there that have to be practiced and understood and then correctly implemented. It's a lot. It's a lot to manage. And it's hard. And so, are you good enough? No, of course not. Like, none of us are. Because we want to be better. But at the same time, like, we're good enough in that we're progressing, we're growing, we're learning new things, and we got to remember and realize and be gracious with ourselves about the fact that art is immense. There's so many facets to it. I feel like the more I talk about this, make videos, the more I do art, talk to my students that graduated last year or some that are still in school, the more I continue to wrap my head around all these things, it's like I have these little minor epiphanies. And I wonder why I didn't have these while I was teaching sometimes, because they seem like things that you would be running into while you're teaching. And I realized that while I was teaching, although I was teaching drawing, painting, graphic design, art, all these things, dropping my paintbrush, I wasn't spending a lot of time contemplating art, because so much of teaching is the humanistic elements. So much of teaching is grading and planning and dealing with the administration and the school board and the stuff that comes down from the local district. A lot of teaching is not the subject matter you're working on. If you're a science teacher, very little of your time is actually spent doing science-related things. The average teaching work week is probably 45 to 50 hours, and in that time, probably maybe 10 hours a week, you're really thinking about and processing art. And the sad part about that is, what that means is all the time that you're grading art and giving lessons, it's really more rote. It's not really a lot of art happening in your mind while you're doing that. My AP classes, my upper division classes, were the ones where I had to sit down and had to think about what was actually happening, because the questions that the students were asking were complicated. And that forced me to actually have to sit down and think, and it would slow me down. So I'm thinking about a lot more of these things now that I'm out of the classroom on a daily basis. I'm starting to contemplate all these things that really, like, my students were contemplating, especially the art ones, or the ones that are going to art school or working on developing their professional portfolios right now. It's really intriguing. So these are like just all these things floating around in my brain that I'm processing. It's like, oh my goodness, these are things that I probably should have been thinking about for ages and just didn't have the bandwidth to. Let's let this chunk dry and come back in a few minutes, and we'll start playing with it. I know it doesn't look like much right now. It really just looks like playing, and maybe it won't look like anything when I'm done either. But we'll come back in a few, and we'll start adding some ink and some additional watercolor on top and see what happens. And here we are, magically 20 minutes later. All right, let's start working through some of these things and just seeing kind of what happens. So when I start drawing like this, I'll generally just do exactly what you're seeing right now. I'll start with just a point. I'll start manipulating it and see what happens. There are certain things that as I'm doing this, I kind of can't help but thinking about what this might be. You know, down here, for example, I got these two shapes, and then inadvertently, because I knew I was trying to stay away from making anything that was too specific, inadvertently I started making like a skull just because, you know, habits. That's kind of what happens. So yeah, you don't have to do anything. This is a sketchbook. This is my mixed media sketchbook, and it can be whatever the heck I want. And right now, that's unknown. So even though I waited 20 minutes, it looks like some of this watercolor hasn't soaked in entirely. I'm getting a little bit of bleed from my markers or from my pens. It's not really that big a deal. It won't matter in the end. But just in case you were curious about what's happening there. My brain, this is already turning into kind of a dragon. I doubt that I'll be able to do the entire image as a single thing, though. I just don't see a way that is going to function. But I might surprise myself. I'm planning on doing multiple layers, so I might not finish this whole page in this setting, or in this sitting. I might end up having to put on a couple layers of this pen and then go back through and do another layer of the watercolor, and then so forth and so on. I think that's probably how this is going to come together. So yeah, that's not too bad right there. Kind of getting some nice... I'm not sure how the mouth is going to function here, so maybe... Sorry for shifting my chair there. Maybe this thing will be something else kind of in front of the guy. Maybe we could do this as a hand. Yeah, I think that might work. Been using the brush pens for a lot of this kind of stuff recently, and I find that they're probably a more pleasurable way to do this. But there's something about watercolor. It flows and it moves, and because you're using the brushes, it doesn't always do exactly what you're thinking it's going to. And there's something about that process when you're making art like this, where there's not a lot of intention and you're kind of just playing. I think that using a medium that is not perfectly controllable is a better idea. And so that's why I wanted to use watercolor for this. And, you know, watercolor is one of my favorite things to mess with. I love how it layers. I love how it builds on itself. I love how malleable it is. And now with my discovery of gouache, it's just become even better, because now I know that I can go and do layers on top of it if I really want to. And that takes away some of the stress that always existed with watercolor. Granted, I do think it's probably a good thing to have media like that where you know you can't fix anything. I think that's part of why pen is such a beneficial medium, is because in the end you know that you can't fix things, and that forces you often to be a little bit more careful. And I think that that's a good thing in general for artistically working. Not always. Sometimes you want to have the ability to be a little bit less precise or to work out an idea. For me, I get that digitally. Or I've been doing some acrylic work lately, and that's also kind of that way, where you can continue to manipulate it, continue to work with it after the fact. I wonder how this would work on colored paper. I think that might be kind of an interesting thing to do too. It's a little bit of like ADD, ADHD that is really satisfied by this kind of drawing. It's like, I'm going to draw on this dragon for a minute and get to a point where I don't quite know what I'm doing, and then I'll just jump ship to another thing because I can. And because there's no clear plan, that's totally fine. But it's always a kind of interesting, satisfying component of this kind of drawing, is it allows me just to jump back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on things. I do find it sometimes difficult to finish things though because of that. I have a tendency to dive in, and I think I must just enjoy the beginning parts of a project more. Maybe that's you too. Maybe that's really common. But I have a tendency to just really enjoy the beginning stages, and I get further in and it's like, I'm just like not as interested as I once was. I find it way easier to start things than I do to finish them. But ironically, I don't mind coming in later and finishing things, because it's just like a different level of stress, different kind of stress, I guess is a better way to say that. What do you guys think? Are you kind of similar in that you like starting things and you like finishing things, but you don't maybe like doing it all in the same motion? I think that's probably the best way to describe it for me. I'm the same way with cooking though. Like, I like cooking a lot. I don't mind cleaning the kitchen afterwards, but I really hate cooking and then cleaning. Like, I'm much happier to leave it be for a little while and then come back later and do the cleanup. I don't like doing the cleanup right after I cooked. I don't know why. I totally understand why it would make sense not to like the cleaning or not to like the cooking, but to just not like them in sequence, I don't quite understand why that's the way my brain processes it. Well, that's a weird thing, isn't it? Yeah, let's start covering that in with some darker bits and see what happens. Do you guys find it hard to finish a sketchbook? I have a tendency to just get excited and put time into a sketchbook and then shift and do another sketchbook. And so like right now I have 4 or 5 sketchbooks that I'm working on simultaneously, which makes it really hard to finish one because I may have done, 100 pages worth of drawing, but it's 100 pages worth of drawing scattered in like 5 or 6 or 7 sketchbooks. And so I've got sketchbooks that I've been working on for a year or more now that aren't completed. So I'm trying to be a little bit faster, especially because I want to start doing more recent sketchbook tours. I think that might be nice for some folk to see. And it's kind of fun to reminisce and go back through old things too. So what about you guys? Do you just have one sketchbook, you work in that, you finish it, you move on, or do you also use multiple sketchbooks? And what kind of sketchbooks? Do you have a preference? Is it something that like you just get whatever you get at that moment? I didn't realize until pretty recently that there was a big difference between different kinds of sketchbooks. It seems reasonable, right? Like totally logical that there would be these massive differences because obviously watercolor paper is phenomenally different than drawing paper. But I've just realized recently that like there's this massive difference between something like Bristol and pen or an ink sketchbook, or just a plain drawing sketchbook, or a mixed media sketchbook, or a watercolor sketchbook. And so, of course, me being me, got real excited and have purchased most of those, and that's why I can't finish things in a single sketchbook, because it's just too exciting. And it'll probably be fine, because what'll happen here soon is I'll finish one, and then I'll have one off the table, and I'll be able to dedicate most of my time to the other ones, and then I'll finish them faster. And then I should get back in a cycle of just trying to finish like a sketchbook a month. That's kind of my goal. I don't ever seem to hit that goal because, again, I just get too excited and have too many things going simultaneously. But you can always hope and dream, right? Goals, they're good for doing things. And good for beating yourself against a wall when you don't quite finish the thing that you're trying to finish. I kind of like this guy. I really don't know what it is, but I kind of like what he's turning into. Reminiscing or going back on the topic earlier about being good enough. I think maybe for me, one of the first good enoughs will be when I feel like I can get something random like this to just look the way that I want it to. Something to turn out in an interesting, dynamic way, where I can figure out how a hand has to go, the direction of a claw, when I'm more instinctual as far as understanding that, like, well, this is the zenith of that thing, and how that would function, how that would come together, how that would make all the things around it work. All of it's in stages. Over my long time of working on art, I feel like there have been things that I've conquered, but it's hard to remember those. Talked about that recently on one of the podcasts. It's hard to remember all of the things that you've succeeded on. It's hard to remember not to be overly hard on yourself, because there are things that you've done well. As artists, man, we're weird. We're really, really good at wrapping our heads around all of the things that we haven't done right. We're really, really proficient at that. And I think that's probably part of what makes us artists, is you have to be able to see the mistakes. You've got to be able to see the good and the bad. You've got to be able to isolate the things that can be improved. And I think in general, we're better at noticing the bad things than we are noticing the good things. Very much in general. Or very much in general, which means like nothing. But I think that's just very much the case. Like, we're much, much better at isolating the bad things and the good. And I think in a lot of cases that works to our benefit, because we can look at the things that we're not doing well, and when you know the things you're not doing well, you know the things you need to work on. But it can be harder for the spirit. It can be harder for the soul to keep working when those are the things that you're obsessed with. Those are the things that you think about constantly. Keep going back and forth trying to figure out, like, how hard is art really? Like, is it as hard as people think it is? Is it actually easy? Is it that it's outside of that range, that it's more complicated than that? That it's not about being easy or hard, it's about the fact that it's just an excruciating amount of time to get to where you want to be. But I think that it is hard. I think there are parts of it that are really, really hard, and I think the part that's hardest, perhaps, is just sticking to it, working your way through the suck. There's a lot of time in the learning process of becoming an artist where your work sucks. And then there's a much, much, much longer time period where it doesn't, but you think it does. Probably because you're just predispositioned to be so hard on yourself and to assume that most of what you're working on is terrible, even when it's not. It's difficult. I feel like I've run into a lot of musicians in my life that have a really good understanding of their skill. They're proud when they ought to be. And I feel like I've run into a disproportionately small quantity of artists that have pride or ego or confidence that is accurate to their skill level. Most of the time, it feels like there's a massive disparity. That, just going back in my brain to so many of my students over the years who were quite skilled or quite gifted in different ways, and so few of them had any real confidence. So many of them wouldn't take compliments from myself or from their peers or from their parents, and they just, I don't know if they assumed that everyone was just being nice and trying to flatter them and make them feel good. I think it was less complicated than that, and more just they didn't believe it, and so even though people were being nice and kind to them, they just couldn't wrap their heads around it. We're so predispositioned to being hard on ourselves. And so it's difficult to be good enough. It's difficult to be good enough because you don't know what it is. And I don't know what it is most of the time either. Wondering here if a second layer of the watercolor is going to be really beneficial, because there's a lot of white space on this. I feel like this particular pen is getting low on its lifespan. I got some new ones recently. They seem to last a long time. Really seem to last. I don't know that I've ever used a Micron until it's like run out of ink. It seems like the nibs on them always get dull or short long before the ink runs out. This guy looks weird. I think it's the eye. That's the single spike in the eye. I kind of had hoped that he would look a little bit more interesting. Not particularly happy with the way that he came out. But, I mean, that's how this goes. And even when you don't have a lot in the way of expectations, you still always have expectations. But it's fine. It's fine. There's a part of my ego that really wants these drawing sessions to always have really cool things or beautiful things or be planned out. And there's been some times where I've had an idea or a reference or two coming into these. And there's been times where I've had a list of topics to talk about. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think it's less authentic. Or I don't think it's inauthentic, but I do think it's less authentic. And so I've kind of opted for, I'm just going to sit down and work, and I'm going to talk when I feel like talking. I pretend this is a live stream, essentially. And whatever comes up is just what I'm going to talk about. And if I've got long periods where I don't talk much, I'll just speed those chunks up so people don't get bored. But not everything's going to turn out well. Not everything's going to be interesting. You're not always going to create a masterpiece every single time you work on a drawing or a painting. It's just not how it goes. And that's fine. So whether you're here to see the magnificent artworks or if you're just here for the conversation, I appreciate your being here. I hope you're making something too. I enjoy the accountability of doing this. I think that's one of the best parts of it. For me, is it just makes sure that I have to be making things. Right now is not the ideal day. It's been these last couple weeks have been much more dense than we anticipated, and it would have been easy, and I think I would have had reasonable excuse to just be like, well, I'm just gonna get one video out this week, but I'm trying to stick to what I committed to do, which was to get a video out on Wednesdays and a video out on Fridays. And it's less that I have a large audience that's going to be disappointed if I don't, more that I think it's good for me. It's good for me to do it. And it's honorable and it's authentic. And if the video that I put out is a little different or it takes a different hue because I'm stressed or I'm out of time, that's not always a bad thing. And there are times where it's good to just, be honest and have integrity and say, you know what, like I just couldn't do it this week. But I haven't hit that point yet. And so I'll keep producing and trust the process and just hope that each video that I do, each session that I do, just hits one person right. It's easy to kind of get wrapped up in a little bit of the, like, oh, I would love if this gets, tens of thousands of views and, tons of people see it. And obviously there's validation and things that come from that. But that's a hard route to let your brain go down. And whilst I won't deny that it would be affirming and validating, I think that it's going to be long-term sustainable much more as I'm doing this because I want to. And I'm doing it because there are going to be some people who are really going to benefit from it. And I'm also not trying to be a martyr because that agitates the crap out of me. I also might just be tired right now and like a little rambly, and that was verging on almost emotional, which my apologies. It's not a common thing for me, but I'm tired. And this is later at night than I usually do these. I usually try to do these sessions earlier in the day, in the morning preferably, if I have the ability. But right now I think it's 8:30 at night, which, is not late at all. I know most of you artists are you're night owls, but I find that my brain works better earlier in the day. I can draw and paint into the wee hours of the morning, but I find that my brain, thus conversation and intelligent thought, seem to work much, much better when it's earlier on in the day. It's probably just coffee. It's that I'm not drinking coffee at 8 o'clock at night, 8:30 at night. And in the morning, obviously, I'm very hyped up and hopped up on it. Man, that's another kind of funny thing. Like, how many artists you run into that don't totally obsess with coffee? Like, most of us, I feel like, are junkies to some degree, which, might not be a great thing, but I've learned recently to love coffee a lot more. I've drank it for a long time, but recently I've started actually going through the process of grinding my own beans every morning and in some cases making nicer coffee drinks, but most of the time just like appreciating the process and the smell of fresh brewed and fresh ground coffee, which I think is a lovely, lovely way to wake up in the morning. Most of the time, coffee for me has just been a means to an end. It helps me stay awake. It helps me not be grumpy. But it's another thing that I've been working on a lot since I got out of the classroom is how do I find joy in the little things in life, because they're consistent. They can be relied upon to be there. And not everything can be. So how do you find joy in the little moments? Truly, how do you find joy when you're drawing a creepy pink and purple monkey thing and it's 8:30 at night and you don't have any coffee? And you also don't have any whiskey. Oh well. Here we are. Here we are. It'd be a different kind of sketching session if that was the case. I love that these microns go over the watercolor so well. Such a pleasant thing. It's not often that I would need to shade in giant areas like this. This is the 05, which is probably 0.45 millimeters, so half a millimeter essentially. Usually I don't use this one very much, and it's really seldom that I feel like I need a bigger one, but for those big eye shading portions, I felt like a bigger one might have been appreciated. Switch back to one of the littler ones. This is a good example of I don't really know what I'm doing. I've kind of got an idea for the facial structure, and this kind of looks like lips or something down here. But what I'll start doing is I'll just start tracing around some of the shapes. You saw that a lot up here. And adding implied texture by just having the lines be next to each other. And then often what happens is while I'm doing that, other things will kind of come to mind, and I can start shaping things in particular ways to get the image to do what I want. But I often just kind of start making lines long before I have an idea which direction I want to go with that. I think this exercise is really good, really beneficial, because the reduced stress of not having a particular concept or idea that has to be communicated means that you're going to try new things. And when you try new things, you always have the chance of running into something that you're going to like and something that you're going to love, something new, something that's going to become a part of your routine. It's like food. You know, if you really like Italian American food and you like pizza, there is a little bit of you that's probably like, no, I don't want to try real Italian food. I don't want to try different kinds of pizzas that are different than what I normally eat. I don't want to try Chinese or Thai food. Like, did you hear they use fish and like everything in that? Like fish sauce. Ugh, what grossness is that? It's easy to have those prejudices. And the problem is that you just don't know if Thai food might be your favorite cuisine that you just haven't tried yet. So it's good. It's good to try new things. And Thai food's phenomenal, by the way. If you don't like Thai food, I'm sorry, but like, go try it again. Go try it many times. It's always a little funky to me when people are like, oh yeah, I just don't like Chinese food. It's like, cool. You do realize that China is a country with enough cuisines that it rivals like the US or Europe in general, and that Chinese people often refer to Western food as being pretty one note and boring. You know, and that seems so audacious to us to like, did you just combine German, Italian, Spanish, French, Croatian, all of those countries, all of Europe, and the United States into Western food? Goodness, like how audacious. But we do the same thing, like Chinese food. I'm just not that big a fan of Chinese food. It's like every province, every region in China has their own cuisine. It's all different. You've got Chinese cuisines that are spicy, Chinese cuisines that are not spicy at all, Chinese cuisines that are largely soup-based, Chinese cuisines that are from the areas where it's super cold, the areas where it's super warm, the areas where it's very lush. Like, it's an immensely different, divergent, and wide, diverse cuisine. So to say that you just don't like Chinese food is crazy. But we like to make assumptions. We're really, really good at making assumptions as humans. I mean, I do it all the time. I make random claims in these videos and assume that it fits many artists, and sometimes I'm wrong. That's fine. Like, I am more than happy and willing to admit when I'm wrong. That's where growth occurs. No growth occurs without pain. Which is one of my classroom rules that eventually I'll probably get back to doing the classroom rules videos. If you haven't seen those, go check them out. They're kind of interesting and funny. It's just these weird list of random rules that I came up with the help of my students over years. But that one's a good one. No growth occurs without pain. And that actually comes from Naruto. The manga, or anime, I suppose. There was a character in that series called Pain, and I found him to be very compelling and very intriguing because his, spoiler alert ahead, if you haven't finished or read or watched the, decade series that ended at least a decade ago. But he was basically a war orphan who had experienced terrible, terrible tragedy. And so his goal was basically to put the world through immense, incalculable pain. And it wasn't because he was seeking revenge, which is what a lot of villains would do. His goal was to basically grow the world up, mature the world. I am going to expose the world to so much pain that they're forced to grow up and mature past war. And one of his mantras was, no growth occurs without pain. The world needs to experience more pain, and then humans will evolve. Humans will become better, and they'll be able to get past these nasty tendencies that they have now. And I mean, it's a terrible idea. Like, let's basically create weapons of genocide. to grow the world up. But it's the same thing that Ozymandias does in The Watchmen, right? It's like, we're going to kill millions to save billions. Like, that's terrible, dude. But also, you have a point. You have a point. I'm glad that we don't deal with those kind of things frequently. I'm glad that the world doesn't have a lot of these things. Or maybe it does behind closed doors and I'm just ignorant. I really, really hope not. Well, this is intriguing. Like, the way that this guy is coming out here is kind of intriguing. It's kind of creepy. It reminds me of Bambina from Toriko, which is another manga that is hilarious and fits into this conversation because it's food-based, but it's also like epic bro shonen nonsense. And there's a monkey, like, it's not a god or anything, but it's just like this immensely powerful ape. And there's features of this that are reminding me of him. Man, if you're looking for a manga and don't know where to go, Toriko is fantastic. So goofy, so goofy. But I loved it. It feels like it ended quickly. I think that happens with a lot of mangas. It's like they get to a point where the producer feels like they're not getting quite as much feedback as they would like, and it's like, okay, like, you got, 16 more chapters, you got to wrap this thing up. I feel like that happens all the time, and it's so sad. But I guess that's just money. Like, there's a lot of money involved in the making of those and the running of those and the printing of them, and I guess it makes sense that somebody would be upset if it wasn't quite meeting whatever the quota was. So, but it's still a bummer. A lot of series that I would like to see finished or would have liked to have seen finished in a way that wasn't rushed. I'm not sure what this thing's going to be now. Like, where to go with it. I'm not sure if these images are all in the same space or if they are going to be all separate. I think this is where I'm going to call it for this session. So I'll come back in another one, and I'll keep working on this. My next batch will probably be watercolor over the top of this. So thanks for hanging out. If you liked it, please feel free to like and subscribe. I would appreciate it. It helps the channel out immensely. And check out some of the other sessions as well, or the podcast that's been coming out with a little bit more regularity recently. So thanks again for tuning in. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.